First section, symbols. The first thing we encounter at the beginning of the film is Genesis 3:24. Paying attention to it can reveal a large part of the film's concept to us. A symbolic analysis of Genesis 3:24 and its reflection in the film, The Fountain. In this section, we will delve into a deep analysis of Genesis 3:24 and its key symbols. This analysis will first be conducted independently without reference to the film, and will then explore its connection to the concept presented in the film, The Fountain. A Jungian approach to symbols. The analytical approach used in this discussion is based on the method of Carl Gustav Jung. In this approach, symbols are examined independently before being placed in the context of a story or character. This method allows us to understand the language of the symbols themselves. Just as in dream analysis, attention is first given to the image itself and not immediately to its interpretation. The text of Genesis 3:24, the book of Genesis, Old Testament, is as follows in English and Persian. English version, King James version. So he drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the garden of Eden cherubims, and a flaming sword which turned every way to keep the way of the tree of life. Persian translation, Old Official Translation. پس آدم را بیرون راند و کروبیان را به سمت شرقی باغ عدن قرار داد و شمشیری آتشین که به هر سو میچرخید تا راه حیات را محافظت کند. Independent symbolic analysis of Genesis 3:24. From a symbolic perspective, this verse is one of the mythological cornerstone of Western thought regarding death, consciousness, and the boundary between humanity and the divine. This verse is one of the primary sources that shaped the fallen man narrative in Western civilization. In the Christian tradition, which is the foundation of Western thought, this narrative defined the first separation between man and God, the first experience of self-awareness, means shame of nakedness, the formation of original sin, and the definition of human history as a return to the lost paradise. As a result, most Western myth, arts, philosophies, and even modern psychologies from Augustine to Freud and Jung are influenced by these archetypal patterns: fall, suffering, atonement, and return. For this reason, this verse is the bedrock of Western thought on the psyche, meaning, and human history. The three key elements in this verse are: 1. The expulsion of man from paradise. This symbolizes the loss of original innocence and the entry into self-awareness. The expulsion is the birth of the ego and a self-awareness that is accompanied by pain, separation, death, and free will. The expulsion is considered both fall and a beginning. 2. The reason for expulsion, gaining knowledge, not mere sin. The expulsion of man from paradise is not necessarily due to the simple violation of a law. As stated in Genesis 3:22, and the Lord God said, Behold, the man is become as one of us, to know good and evil, and know, lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life, and eat, and live forever. Man is expelled because he has become like the gods, knowledgeable of good and evil. If this man also gains access to the tree of life, he will become immortal. In fact, the divine fear is that a limited but conscious being will now also become immortal. This point may lead us to the Jungian view that premature consciousness without psychological maturity is dangerous, especially if we place God in the position of the self that Jung introduced. The complexity of this concept may be lessened, and a mature being that has been created needs to grow before achieving immortality. The mentioning of Adam or man beside of Adam and Eve in Genesis. Genesis 3:24 speaks of the expulsion of Adam, not Eve. This may seem literally or conventional in the text, but from a psychological perspective, it can be seen as the narrative of the expulsion from paradise being about the male. Thus, it must be emphasized that the symbolic position of the male or limited life is about confronting limitation, death, and the boundaries of power. The Anima, Eve, is in the shadow at this moment, hidden, just as the tree of life is hidden behind the flaming sword. Additionally, in the film The Fountain, Genesis 3:24 is manipulated, and instead of man or Adam, it said Adam and Eve were expelled. From a psychoanalytical perspective, especially Lacanian, this separation from life, which is completely pre-linguistic, can be interpreted as the entry into the symbolic order. In this order, Adam is defined as a subject dependent on language and the law, the name of the Father. According to Jacques Lacan, this entry into the symbolic order requires a separation from the real, that is, the pre-linguistic state of primordial unity. In this theoretical framework, woman, Eve, life, nonverbal experience is defined as the absolute other, or that which cannot be fully represented in the form of language. Lacan's famous statement that the woman does not exist refers to the idea that woman as a single and definable concept in the symbolic order, which is defined by man or Adam, has no place. She represents the unrepresentable, the real, and a jouissance that is beyond signifiers. Therefore, the expulsion from Eden can be seen as the symbolic serving of the linguistic subject's connection with the feminine or nonverbal jouissance. The phrase us in God's speech. The use of the phrase become as one of us, Genesis 3:22, is ambiguous and has its roots in remnants of polytheism, or a collective divine narrative. But on a psychological level, us can be a sign of cosmic order or combination of mythological wills. Jung might have said that us is not just God, but the entire cosmic structure of the self, the great self made of the unity of opposing forces, the flaming turning sword. This is a symbol of protecting the secret. It is a tool that blocks the way back to the primordial source. Fire is a sign of transformation, purification, and light, but at the same time it's painful. The turning motion of the sword means that there is no simple direct way back to the wholeness. The only way back is through suffering and a psychological transformation. From a Lacanian psychoanalytic perspective, this flaming sword can be embodiment of the law or the name of the Father, which is blocked the path back to the real, pre-linguistic unity and direct access to the tree of life. It is this law that holds the subject within the symbolic order and makes access to the full jouissance, which in some interpretation is compared to the experience of death or orgasm, impossible or very difficult. The experience of orgasm, especially in some psychoanalytic readings such as that George Bataille, is compared to the experience of death precisely because of the temporary collapse of the symbolic order and the ego, and the proximity to the state of death of the linguistic subject, the temporary loss of the self dependent on language and jouissance that is beyond language. This flaming sword is both the guardian of the border between these two worlds, the symbolic order and the real, and the symbol of the painfulness of the attempt to cross it. The similarity to the flaming sword of Christ's time. The flaming sword in this verse has a deep symbolic similarity to the flaming sword of Christ's time in the book of Revelation. In both cases, the flaming sword is not a physical tool but a symbol of the power of consciousness. This sword is not for killing but for discernment, distinction, and the protection of the sacred. In Christian tradition, Christ's tongue, like a flaming sword, reveals the truth and destroys lies. In Genesis verse, the sword prevents the unprepared from entering the tree of life. And in Revelation, the sword is a tool for separating good from evil on an esoteric level within human beings. In both, we are dealing with something that both burns and illuminates. This is exactly what consciousness does to the unconscious. The verse that refer to the flaming sword of Christ's tongue are Revelation 1:16. And he had in his right hand 7 stars, and out of his mouth went a sharp two-edged sword, and his countenance was as the sun shineth in his strength. Revelation 19:15. And out of his mouth goeth a sharp sword, that with it he should smite the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron. And he treadeth the winepress of the fierceness and wrath of Almighty God. In both verses, the sword coming out of Christ's mouth symbolizes the power of judgment, the word of truth, and ultimate discerning consciousness. This sword is the symbol of distinction. It cuts, it separates, it reveals. Cherubims, guardian angels. These beings are in between man and God, neither of the earth nor of heaven. They are guardians of their whole and are the archetype of the guardian of the unconscious gate, who only steps aside at the time of psychological maturity. In dreams, they sometimes appear as monsters, dragons, dogs, or warriors. Psychic powers. From the perspective of analytical psychology, angels and demons do not exist externally but are psychic image of inner forces. They are powers that have not yet come into our consciousness. An angel may represent inspiration, intuition, or creative potential. A demon, on the other hand, symbolizes the repressed shadow, the stored desire, or destructive complexes. In Jung's word, these beings did not come into being outside of man, but are parts of the psychic structure that have been mythologically externalized throughout history. They can be undeveloped powers, some things in the process of becoming. They act like gatekeepers who says before entering the tree of life, you must see us, know us, and be able to pass through us. The tree of life. This symbol is the center of being, the principle of unity, the source of immaturity and integration. The expelled man has no right to return and touch it until he is ready. In this Lacanian framework, the tree of life can be a symbol of the real or direct access to the complete jouissance and pre-linguistic life. Just as the flaming sword blocks the past, language and the symbolic order structurally prevent the subject from having full access to the real. Life as a continuous flow that cannot be reduced to symbolic meaning, which in here is attributed to the feminine, is fundamentally incapable of being fully signified and can only be approached through non-cognitive and translinguistic experience, such as some dimension of jouissance. This is what Lacanian refers to with the concept of feminine jouissance, which is beyond the polis and the symbolic order. And Lucy Irigaray also emphasized the fundamental unknowability of woman or life in the masculine linguistic culture. The cherubim to the east. In Genesis 3:24, the reference to placing the cherubims and a flaming sword on the east of the Garden of Eden is just not a geographical direction, but a deep and multi-layered symbol of mythological, theological, and psychological concept. In the biblical tradition, the east has always been the place of beginning and the origin of life, where the Garden of Eden was planted, Genesis 2:8, and where the sun rises. In many Asian cosmological systems, including those of ancient Iran, Mesopotamia, and India, the east symbolized beginning, light, and the entry of divine forces. In this verse, the placement of cherubims and the flaming sword on the east side means guarding the way back to the tree of life, a path that is only possible when passing through a fairy test and crossing the boundaries of the sacred realm. From a Jungian analytical psychology perspective, the East can symbolize the higher unconscious or the center of the soul, and being driven out of Eden is considered a break from a state of wholeness and entry into the path of individuation. The return to the Eden means confronting unconscious forces like the shadow, Anima and Animus, and the burning forces of the unconscious, which are personified by the flaming sword. Psychoanalytic view on femininity and non-verbal life in the Eden narrative. A symbolic analysis of Genesis 3:24 from a psychoanalytic perspective is not limited to the Jungian approach. The narrative of the expulsion reveals a fundamental psychological division between two realms. One, the verbal or symbolic realm, where Adam emerged as a subject constituted in language and law. This realm is the domain of self-reflective consciousness, sin, history, and the search for the return that gives us meaning. 2. The non-verbal, pre-symbolic real realm, which is linked to the pure life, primordial unity, femininity, Eve as its representative, and the tree of life. This realm is fundamentally beyond or prior to language and meaning. Access to it in the post-fall symbolic order is structurally limited. Integrating Jungian, Lacanian, and feminist analytical layers allows for a deepening of the symbolic approach. This combination not only gives cohesion to the analysis of concepts such as the non-existence of woman in the symbolic order, the verbal or non-verbal division, and the link between orgasm or death, but also provide a structural critique of male-centric Western narratives. Post-Lacanian feminist theories, especially in the works of Irigaray and Kristeva, shows that life in its biological, emotional, relational, and reproductive dimensions as a fluid, bodily, and irreducible element to abstract rationality has been marginalized or devalued in the dominant symbolic tradition. This marginalization in connection with the Eden story manifests as the separation from the tree of life and the placement of the flaming sword as a barrier, a symbol of the break between masculine culture or masculine order and raw, unlimited flow of life. In the context of the film The Fountain, such an approach can raise fundamental question. Is the queen or tree of life character the embodiment of the feminine, non-verbal, and unattainable life that the male subject, the Tommy, is searching for? Is Isabel's death and Tom's attempt to save or immortalize her a reflection of the inability of the scientific masculine symbolic order to fully understand or conquer the principle of feminine life? The alternation of the verse in the film from Adam to Adam and Eve can be also seen as a sign of a conscious effort to bring the erased other back to the center of the narrative. From a feminist perspective, this reading as a critical layer that reveals the male biased and oppressive nature of tradition narrative redefines woman from the position of the culprit to the symbol of the non-verbal life and a different jouissance, and emphasize the fundamental and irreducible differences in human experience. Such a view establishes a clear conceptual link between life, femininity, the non-verbal, and jouissance, and show their structural erasure in the dominant symbolic order. Ultimately, this approach allows for the imagination of a symbolic order with a bisexual structure in which the repressed aspect of human experience can find equivalent and meaningful place.